All right, we are all set. So anytime you're ready to go, we are ready for you.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Kaiser.
Oh,
Good
thank you.
afternoon, everybody. I am honored to be a part of this winter conference, and my work is with my research is with the Yucatec Maya curanderas, and I also work with Tzotzil Maya Muslim community in Chiapas, Mexico. But I wanted to tell you about why stories matter today. And this is part of my dissertation, my research at Florida State University. And I'm scheduled to defend my dissertation in 2 months. So I am pleased to share this with you. So, looking at stories mattered and finding Nuestras Voces during the pandemic, this is just an overview of what I'll be talking about, because I had to shorten it a little just to fit the 30-minute or 25-minute time frame. So I'm looking at it from Historia Teorías, and Gloria Saldúa talked about auto Historia Teorías. And, coming from Belize or from the US, you have had grandparents, you have had elders talk to you and tell you stories about their times. And I recall, my own grandmother telling me about, era una vez, or there was a time, there was something going on. Let us share what happened. And I was looking at the word matter. The word matter, as an English teacher, former English teacher, I look at both the noun and the verb aspect. And so when we look at stories, then they're important because they're theories, they're life. But they matter also because they have substance, and they add that substance to life. As for our stories, we also think about how others have told our stories, about his stories that changed our names or places or claim, just a claim to divide. These changed our stories, but also impacted how we see ourselves, how we look at our own culture, how we look at our sense of belonging, our identity overall, because it is interwoven with land, with people, with history. So we look at what is it about Nuestras Voces, or representation, that is so essential. And so then I wanted to look at it, especially from the indigenous stories point of view or perspective, and looking at it as a medium for decolonization, because they reflect our lived experiences. They are also a way to represent ourselves with our own voices, and to show that connection to land and healing. But it also, our stories also offer a chance to revitalize language and to transfer that traditional language across generations. Because according to Brian Brayboy, they teach us about diplomacy, about sovereignty, about survival and resistance, which he uses as survivance. But most importantly, as my curanderas were telling me, it's about transferal of knowledge across generations and between generations. And you might, if you're from Benque or from Sokots, you might recognize this lady here. She's my Abuelita Fina. And she's with Father Mark, and Father Mark loves Red Fanta. That's another story. But at her 100th birthday, I recall having so many stories about her life within those 100 years. And so I wanted to take this opportunity to use that kind of framework and look at Abuelita Epistemologies. Why Abuelita Epistemologies? Gonzalez says that Abuelitas show us that we have a history, have an identity. They're teachers, they're leaders, they're tradition keepers, and they're also cultural warriors. And so those stories are enmeshed within our memories. And these Yucatec Maya curanderas believe that these stories are in our genes. So we have a way of taking that genetic memory and applying it to life today, especially during the pandemic, was what they were showing me. So when I think about my Abuelita Fina's table that was scraped down, after every lunch, that smell of the meats that hung over the fire hearth, the neighbor's yard visible through the slats and the sunbeams coming in, the red clay of Benque, all of these are interwoven with her teachings about so many different things. But especially, I wanted to look at how those stories and how these women as jefas, as women that have substance, that want to tell their stories, how that comes out during a time of rajadura. And Saldua talks about rajadura, about the split. And that split here is at the pandemic. But how they take advantage of that liminal space that the pandemic created, and that Ansaldua calls Nepantla. What happened in that time? What happened within that space? And I want to tell you about the transformation that happened as these women used their different roles and how these intersected to be able to survive and to help their communities also survive and to heal. And so I also wanted to use one of Bordas is look at leadership and how faith, esperanza, how miracles, humility, courage, that coraje, and celebration gives us that attitude of palante, that we're constantly moving forward. And I wanted to also use Linda Smith's work in terms of decolonizing methodologies, but looking at three aspects of doing research with Indigenous people and looking at how these women were using a form of remembering, connecting, and claiming to be able to do this work during the pandemic. So just a brief note on Indigenous worldviews and healing then. Indigenous communities and the Yucatec Maya are no different. They think that there's this fluid connection between the earth, heavens, and the spirit world. And so when they were looking at their own healing then, they're looking at that balance, that harmony between the body, the spirit, and the mind. And so they do it using their traditional beliefs, their rituals, their practices to heal ailments that now we see coming up even in modern or Western medicine. And so they talk about susto, abobilis, empacho, mal aire, mal diojo, these things that are coming up also in a different classification of illnesses. And I wanted to introduce you to my curanderas. Actually, there are three participants because Doña Anselma, who is the participant, the first participant that I contacted, she was 104 when I first established that relationship with her. But just 2 months before I was supposed to start my data collection, she transitioned into ancestorhood. So I have three participants who have shown me what it means to rely on their culture, to rely on their knowledges and their ways of knowing. And first of all, then I wanted to show these women how their trust, how their faith has made such a big difference during the time of crisis, and how their stories count, how their stories matter because they're interwoven with family, community, and environment. And when we look at these knowledge holders, then they found themselves in this rajadura, in this frightening place. However, they turned not only to the creator and their ancestors, but into their knowledge and into their intuition to address this changing context. And so they traveled into what Ansaldua calls the present identity, into a new identity that helped them to transform themselves and their knowledge within that space of Nepantla. So Bordas is telling us that fe, is a deeply seated thread that permeates everyday life, and prescribes how people should treat one another. And so these women embody that. So when they were looking at their faith then, they believe that every single plant on God's good earth has a healing property. However, we don't know them, but we should be listening to them. And so these women, one especially, who's looking at bringing the plants with her to every interview, and the plant, she would wave with the plants and say hola, as if the plants were speaking. And so they're looking at how these plants are non-sentient relatives of humans. There is so much to offer, so much that the environment gives us. And they look at themselves as a medium between the spirits of the plants themselves, because that is an energy that allows healing to happen, and that of the creator. So they are an in-between then. And so when one of them was telling me, Aurora was telling me, if you want that healing to work, you have to put faith and heart on it, because you don't just take an egg or medicinal plant and expect it to work. And Anastasia was telling me that presence that I feel, that you might call intuition or a sixth sense, or that sense that somebody else is there, I call that Dios. Yo le amo Dios. And so then for them, it's not about me. It's not that individualistic aspect. It's about a communal and community aspect of we. And when I look at what Isabella was saying, here she says about her grand uncle Don Eligio Panti, Aurora was saying, it's like he's part of me and I am part of him. And that is why he knows I have to be the one to carry the knowledge to the community. And so she's looking at respect and reciprocity. When we look at Milagros, then there's a balance between restoring that harmony, that balance between the physical, the spiritual, and the psychological aspect also. And so that transforming continues to take place with humility. These women don't believe that this is their work. This is God's work happening. It's about the healer having the allies that are the plants. And in their responsibility to others then, because they strongly believe that they should be using their healing for community, they're looking at how they are these persons that have something to give back. They have to listen to people when they come to them so that they know what's going on beyond just the physical. And they expect to be guided by their ancestors. And doing this with the help of ancestors, with the creator, with the people themselves that come to them as patients. And as servants of the people then, they think that this life purpose should not carry a monetary value, but they do accept, whatever they say in Spanish, lo que tu corazón te nace, or lo que nace en tu corazón. So you give what you think is appropriate, and they call that a blessing. And some people say that is why most of these healers, indigenous communities are poor, or they live in poverty. That coraje, that courage that they blend into with faith, and looking at how to go about dealing with something that just ruptured their way of being, the way they did healing. They had to address ailments in a completely different context. And they had to make sure that they themselves were not getting sick. And so they had to find creative ways. They had to find new ways with faith, with humility and courage to be able to resist what people were saying, like, no, the plants, that's just superstition. All right. So they had to battle this form of colonization to be able to find what they call social justice, because they were doing this not only for their communities, for the environment, but also for the world. And so they were remembering, and I break that word up because it wasn't just a form of recalling, but it also was a form of reconstruction and rebuilding through their response to the pandemic and using their experiences to come up with these new ways to deal with this kind of new illness. They were also reconnecting to their ancestors and their communities through place and space. And I note that it is not only physical space, but it's also about virtual spaces. And so they were using Zoom, they were using social media, they were using YouTube and so forth to talk to others, to upload their videos of their plants and what they were doing. So when you look at response specifically, Smith talks about healing and transformation happening when we remember. They were saying, it is our responsibility And so Aurora is saying, you see this COVID we're talking about? I am listening, I am learning more about it, and I'm watching how it is affecting us in terms of the body. But it is how it is affecting the whole world. But the problem is that I wonder if I have anything that I can do. And so she started looking for the different plants and making those concoctions to bring different plants together. And she connected to her community because she was looking at how her brother-in-law, her sisters, her children could help in gathering this type of healing plants. While Anastasia was sending me videos. She's saying, you know what, I broke down the disease into this way. It affects the lungs, it affects the blood, it affects your immune system. And so she started gathering plants to put these together. And she says she remembered certain things that her grandfathers had told her. And so she started to put all of that knowledge together. And so when we look at indigenous values, then it's about giving back. So this was their way of looking at how are they giving back. And Anastasia was saying, if someone comes right now and asks me for a medicine immediately, I have nothing written down. It all comes up from here, from her head. Now, when we look at that courage, you know, Aurora was saying, this is another challenge that I have to meet. This is something different. So I had to meditate. I had to go into meditation to be able to see how I'm going to address this and how I'm going to use the plants to be able to come up with something that can help people in my community. And so we look at how they reach across to be able to connect with plant relatives then, to talk to the plants, to access the plants, to help them in their healing situation or in this kind of situation. But it is also, they were telling me that it is about becoming whole through connections. And so they were grateful, that gracias, you had to give thanks to be able to still serve your community. And Borges is saying that gratitude is to be happy and to live in grace. That is what it's all about. And so when they were looking at connecting and becoming whole, then it was through this relationship that they have with the environment, with healing, and with that kind of harmony and well-being that nature, that being in nature and with nature brings. So it was a respect for non-human relatives, and it was about getting permission from these entities and not taking too much from nature, but just what you need. And so their practice then had to change with the context. They had to find alternative ways. And so Anastasia was saying, you know, they still come to me, but I can't go to them. So from that distance, they call, you know, those who didn't have her number to call her would say, Doña Tasia, por favor, you know, díganos qué podemos usar. Tell us what we can use. And so she would tell them while still being cognizant of the protocols in place and keeping that kind of distance. And so then they were continuing to build community through the good relations that they already had, through that reciprocity of giving back, but of also being able to do it in a different time and space and a different platform. And so they were saying, you know what, this is about using our healing abilities. This is about using our gift, about making sure that we tend to our people and using our experiential knowledge to be able to do that. When we look at, they still found time to show that gratitude through celebration. And so they shared with me what they were doing for finados or Hanal Pishan. They were also telling me what was happening in life. There was still celebration of all these different stages of life. You know, the Hitsmek, the first menarche. It's about celebrating menopause you've already given, and you continue to give as this elder. But they also invited me to what was they call this celebration of Thanksgiving. It was Mother Nature's ceremony. So they went out into the nearby forest, and they prepared to give thanks, first of all, for Belize's being spared of the 2 hurricanes that had definitely impacted our neighbors. But it was also to ask that Belize, the region, the world, and you should have heard their prayers. They were in Bukit Maya, Yucatec Maya, Mopan Maya, sorry, and Yucatec Maya in Spanish, asking for this reprieve from this COVID-19. And so then, this is what Linda Smith is telling us about claiming. You know, as leaders, as nepantleras, jefas, or like my abuelita Fina would say, chingonas, these women claim their identity, their culture, and their knowledge. These are acts of survival and resistance or survivance. It's about resilience and empowerment. And so when, as they were resisting, then they were saying, you know what, we have to fight this loss of belief that we're seeing in these generations here. But it's also about that social injustice where Western hegemonic ways or ways of thinking dispel or just see our ways of knowing as invalid, as irrational, as unempirical. And when Aurora was talking about it, she says, you know, like, in my heart, I know there's a medicine for it in the jungle. I want to share it with the world, but will the world accept it? I want the world to say it's a healer that is saying it. We should respect it because they know, the healers know about the plants. They have been doing it for a long time. And Isabella said the same thing. Isabella said, you know what? Our ancestors had no doctors and they were using these medicines for so many generations. Why is it not valorized now? Why is it marginalized? And that sense of that knowledge is being lost. You just compel them, just propel them, you know, into this stance, this resilience. And they were looking at it instead of deficit, they were looking at it as a form of increase. And so they spurred into action. And so they said they had to be positive, they had to help their community in one way or another. And so this kind of communication then is that stories of history have no ending. The pandemic is increasing inequalities, as we saw, but it also provided these women a form of communication with community and environment and ancestors to be able to promote healing. And so they found that as a form of empowerment. You know, they were very upfront and saying, you know, we have to protect ourselves, but it is service at a distance. We are supporting people as we go along with healing. And it's about doing it through ceremonies, also praying, fasting, meditating. And so they're encouraged that this disease and disease will end, that it will connect us through a deeper purpose, and that it will move us forward to engage with each other as they're sure that other diseases are coming. And so there are qualities then, this quality of faith, this quality of humility and of giving thanks. It's all about resilience being evident in that palante attitude. And Borges says, you know, hope, gratitude, and celebration transformed oppression and need into an enduring faith in life's goodness. And that is what we saw during this pandemic. Because if you look at your own homes, what happened? What was that resilience that kept you from giving in? What kept you saying this is going to end? This lockdown is going to just be short-lived. This is going to happen. How did you go through each phase? It was that resilience. You know, and they were saying, first of all, if we were going to have a palante attitude, we had to think about keeping the balance, about rituals. And how did they do it? By telling stories. They told their grandchildren stories. They were living with other people, so they were sharing. They were sharing with me. They were sharing on YouTube. All right? They were talking about cooking and eating together, about eating your medicine. They also talked about forgiveness and healing, about this time being a time to release negativity, as one of the curanderas said, because releasing that negativity renews you. And for Anastasia, it was so difficult because she said, this pandemic almost broke me. I got so emotional when they would come to me and I couldn't attend to them. I felt terrible. However, I'm already old and I need to take care of myself. So she's aware of all these things. They also saw themselves as parts of a larger whole. Aurora said, that's how interconnected we are. This pandemic showed us that we are so interconnected. Look at how fast we can connect through one virus. But also, it should allow us to think that this is not only about us. And so it's about survive and stand. And she said, we can't give up and we can't give in. We just have to continue to see what we can do. We just have to hope that things will continue and they will come back as to the way they were. Maybe they won't, but it's not only about me and you, but it's a whole world that is going through this. And so this has implications then. These stories are not only for policymakers, but also for educators, because we need to preserve these indigenous and traditional healing knowledges, because that is where I started. Decolonizing methodology says, you go to the people, you go to indigenous people and you ask them, what do they see as the issue that needs to be researched? And they were saying it's a loss of their knowledge. And so they're saying, these knowledges cannot be excluded from educational institutions. This type of knowledge production is another way of learning that should be made space for. And so then I'm saying that we should include them as part of what Eve Talk calls rematuration of curricular studies, where the elders come in, where they share, where they tell us about these worldviews and what is happening. Also, do revitalization of the language. So it's looking at alternative ways of transferal of these indigenous knowledges, if you will. But it's also about making space, about valuing nuestros conocimientos, our knowledges. It's about an awareness of and access to knowledge holders. And those are just two aspects here that I wanted to share with you. These are my references, and thank you so much for being a part of, for joining me today in this sharing of these women's stories, their voices, our voices, nuestras voces. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'm open to that.